Hello true crimeers, it's time for another compilation video. So this is going to be another compilation from TikTok of cases of serial killers. Wah, wah. So this is, I think, 25 stories of serial killers that I covered. So let's just get right into it, huh? Without further ado, here you go. Viewer discretion is advised. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He would murder 8 people over the course of 1 week. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Nick Sheely. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 93-year-old Russell Reed of Sterling, Illinois. He was a farmer. He was a loving husband whose wife unfortunately had passed away in 1995. He was considered just one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet, someone who had no enemies. He never, ruffled any feathers. Unfortunately, on June 23rd, 2008, he would come into contact with an absolute monster. Nick was a career criminal, typically dealing in drugs. He was also arrested many times for domestic incidences. He had married a woman named Holly in 2008. On that fateful June 23rd day in 2008, Nick would be looking for money. Money for cocaine. And he was going to get it any way he could. He just so happened to come across Russell Reed, where he just bludgeoned him to death in order to steal money off of his persons. And then he took his body and he hid it in the trunk of his car, and he wasn't found until 3 days later. Pictured here was 65-year-old Ronald Randall. He was a United States Army veteran. He had over 30 years of service. He was a big fan of playing paintball and also loved the Dallas Cowboys. He was a loving, caring father and a loving, caring grandfather. But unfortunately, as fate would have it, he would come across Nick Sheely on June 28th, 2008. Randall had gone to a gas station in Galesburg, Illinois. He just went there to get his car washed real quick. But Nick Sheely needed a vehicle, and he needed more money for more drugs. So just by happenstance, he comes across Randall, and he kills him as well. He then just dumped his body behind a grocery store and stole his car. The next day, he drove to Rock Falls, Illinois. This time, Nick had an actual target. This was 29-year-old Brock Branson. He was a truck driver. He loved to fish. He loved boating. He just loved the outdoors in general. During his trucking work, he met a woman. Her name was Kai Blake. The two of them fell in love. And then she had a 2-year-old child named Devin. Nick here was under the impression that Brock was sleeping with his wife, which would turn out not to be true. On June 29th, 2008, Brock and his wife and her child would come back to their apartment after a day of doing errands. Also there at the apartment was their 25-year-old friend and roommate, Kenneth Ulve. He worked as a roofer, he had a son, and he was described just simply as a really nice kid who would do anything for anyone. But unfortunately, his life would be cut short. Nick would break into their apartment when all of them were home, and he would bludgeon to death all of them. Nick would use a hammer to bludgeon all of them, including the 2-year-old baby. Now, police had already kind of caught on that the person doing all of this was him, but they just weren't able to find him. He left behind some DNA at a crime scene that they were able to very quickly match to him, so they just needed to know where the hell he was and why he was doing this. Unfortunately, he wasn't done. Pictured here was a very happy married couple, Tom and Jill Estes. They lived in Arkansas, but they were actually going to be in Festus, Missouri for a graduation. Jill worked with special needs students at a school, and Tom worked for the Pacific Railroad Company. They had 2 kids of their own, including a grandchild. They were huge animal lovers, and they just loved people in general, and they were known to help strangers if they ever needed it. Again, just by random happenstance, Nick Sheely would come across them as he was trying to flee into another state, and he needed a new vehicle and more money. They just so happened to be walking out of their hotel room when he got to them, and he bludgeoned them to death as well. Now, he had stolen Randall's vehicle from earlier, and then he hid their bodies in the trunk of that car. And then he hid that truck behind a gas station, and then stole their car. Police were able to find him on CCTV wearing the victim's clothing, one of the victim's clothing. They were able to sort of, again, confirm with DNA that this was all being committed by him, and it really just appeared to be incredibly random. He was a druggie who needed money, and he wanted revenge on people who actually didn't do anything. There was no proof that Brock was doing anything with his wife. Nick would finally be found at this bar in Missouri, and he was arrested. He was charged with all 8 counts of murder. He would end up being convicted for all 8 murders in 2 different states, and he got life sentences for each one of them without the possibility of parole. True crimeers, this is the case of Clay King Smith. Viewer discretion is advised. This case takes place in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Yeehaw? I don't know. In March of 1998, Misty Irwin, who was dating Clay King Smith at the time, would call police. She was going to ask police to help her get out of the house because Clay was abusive and potentially could harm or even kill her. Police arrived at the house. Misty Irwin then turned them away, stating she no longer needed them and she wanted to retract her complaint or her statement. And in doing so, she was basically electing to stay with Clay Smith. Later, police were called to the home of Clay Smith after gunshots were heard being fired. When police arrived and they cleared the scene from any, active shooters, they walked into the house and they saw a bloodbath. In the house were 5 bodies. Misty had been shot 3 times. Her cousin, Shelley Sorg, had been shot multiple times. And unfortunately, I don't have any real pictures. I just have these blurry ones, but these 2 kids right here were Shelley's children. Taylor and Sean were also both shot dead. And then they also had their babysitter over there, 12-year-old Samantha Rhodes, pictured here. She too was shot multiple times. Clay King Smith had fled the scene, but by the following day he had been arrested. And this was after he put police through a shootout where no one else was injured or killed. And he was arrested. And he wouldn't really go to trial. He actually fully admitted everything he did. He was a violent man with violent tendencies who was abusing his girlfriend. And unfortunately, in situations like this, I say it all the time, it is very difficult for a woman to get out of this situation. It's not easy. And when he found out she was trying to get out of it, he punished her and everyone that was there that day. Clay Smith would go through the whole psychiatric treatment to make sure he was sane, and they said yes, he was. And he was just convicted of all counts of murder, and he was sentenced to death. What a shame. On May 8th, 2001, Clay King Smith was executed by lethal injection. Peace. Hello, true crimeers. This is the serial killer case of Ricky Lee Green. Viewer discretion is advised. I don't really have a ton of photos to work with here, so we'll make do. Ricky here was born on December 27th, 1960 in Fort Worth, Texas. Yeehaw! And cue the serial killer profile. He was raised in a really abusive home. He, along with his siblings, were physically abused, emotionally abused, and this was a damn near every single day type deal. Apparently, their father would attach like electric nodes or whatever to their bodies and shock them. When Ricky would go fishing with his father would randomly just take his head and put it in the water until he nearly drowned and then let him go. Later in life, he would become addicted to alcohol, drugs, you name it. And then he had an incident with some barbed wire, which caused him to lose one of his eyes. I don't know which one it is, but one of those eyes is a glass eye. And then he met a Cabbage Patch doll in real life, aka Sharon Dollar. Don't worry, it's okay to make fun of her. You'll find out soon. In 1985, he just so happened to meet 16-year-old Jeffrey Lynn Davis. I believe this is a slightly younger photo of him. But on March 27th, 1985, he vanished. The next month, his decapitated body was found in a Fort Worth, reserve area. His body was mutilated, including castration. On October 12th, 1985, Ricky would meet a female by the name of Betty Jo Monroe. Unfortunately, I do not have a photo of her. She was a stripper, and he managed to convince her to get into his car and go back to his place with his wife. And then, for whatever motives she had, Sharon, along with her husband, repeatedly sexually assaulted the woman, and they took turns stabbing her. She was stabbed 17 times, and then they struck her over the head with a hammer. They dumped her body, and she was found the next day. November 23rd, 1975, he met Sandra Bailey here at a club, and again, brought her back to his place. And then our psycho duo repeatedly sexually assaulted her, stabbed her 30 times, and hit her over the head with a hammer, and then dumped her body. She was found a week later. December 29th, 1986. Ricky would meet up with an old acquaintance of his, Stephen Pfefferman. They went back to Stephen's place under the ruse they would have sex. Ricky would tie him to the bed and then just stab him repeatedly until he was dead. He then stole his money and his car. Sharon would eventually confess all of this to a therapist, and she would take a plea deal and only got 10 years in prison. Ricky was convicted and sentenced to death. He got lethal injection in 1997. Hello, true crimers! This is the story of spree killer Mark Barton from Stockbridge, Georgia. He was married to Deborah Spivey, and the two of them had 2 children, Matthew and Michelle. The family would move to Alabama because a job that Mark had got required him to move there. However, shortly after beginning that job, he became very paranoid, and he kind of went a little cuckoo-cuckoo. His performance at the job sucked, so they fired him. After he was fired, he was caught sabotaging the company's data, and he actually went to jail for this for some time. He then moved back to Georgia with the family where he got a new job, and he started sleeping around. Naughty, naughty Mark. Jesus. In 1993, his wife, Deborah, and her mother, Eloise, were found bludgeoned to death in their home. Barton would be suspected of killing both of them, but he was never charged with anything. They never really had the evidence to go after him for it. A couple years later, in 1995, he remarries. Her name is Leanne Van Diver. This is Mark with his family. Unfortunately, he was not getting any better mentally. He began having paranoid delusions and would suffer from depression. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, on July 27th, 1999, Barton snapped. He just woke up and he beat his wife to death. He then did the same thing to both of his children and covered them all with blankets. He left notes on their bodies saying, "I'm not the one who killed my first wife." Yeah, okay. The note would also say he planned to live just long enough to kill all of the people that caused his life's destruction. Right, because that wasn't just you, bud. After slaughtering his own family, he then went to his old job in Atlanta called Momentum Securities. He went in, had some chats with some old co-workers, they were having some laughs, when he just then pulls out guns and starts shooting people. He would end up taking the lives of 4 people in that building. So today, he's now up to 7 kills. He then just coldly walked over to another building, the Alltech Investment Building, just walked in and shot and killed 5 more people. 4 hours later, he finds himself in Kennesaw, Georgia, where he actually tries to kidnap a girl as a hostage, but she escaped. Around the same time, the police found the bodies in his home. Police then noticed Barton's minivan, and he was in it driving it. So, a high-speed chase began. But it ended pretty quickly at a gas station nearby. Police slowly approached the van, trying to get him to come out, when he then took his pistol and he ended his own life. So including himself on that day, he killed 13 people. 12 of them innocent. Not to mention that he'd also killed his previous wife and her mother, more than likely. Do background checks on anyone you ever date. Okay. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of serial killer Ronald Janssen. Viewer discretion is advised. Ronald here was born in Beardslee, Belgium in 1971. He was child number 3 of 4 total. He apparently had a lisp as he was growing up, so he was repeatedly bullied at school all the time for it. He was allegedly emotionally abused by his father. I don't see anything about him being physically abused, but at one point it became so bad for Ronald that he tried to kill his own father. His dad was a diabetic, and instead of giving him insulin one time, he just pumped some random liquid into him. But it did not work, and his father lived. Eventually, his mother would file for divorce from their father, and all 4 kids moved out and lived with their mom. By 1993, Ronald met his wife, and by 1998, he was a teacher teaching mechanics and computers. In 2006, his wife divorced him, and then he was alone for the first time in quite some time. And then things took a huge turn for the worse. I can't find any stories referring to when the disconnect was for Ronald and what his motives were for these next parts of his life, but in 2007, 18-year-old Aniek van Uitsel, she was just out on a bike ride, something she did every day, when all of a sudden Ronald Janssen came out of the shadows holding a knife and pointed it to her. He would then force her inside his vehicle and took the bike and put it in there as well. He brought her inside of his apartment where he just beat her over the head with a hammer. And then he took her and he held her underwater in a bathtub until she stopped moving. He then painted her bike and then put it out somewhere so that police would just be completely confused by it. And then her body was found on May 3rd, 2007, and it is believed that he sexually assaulted her as well. And then he went quiet for a couple of years until 2010, when his neighbors came home from a coffee shop, and his neighbors were 18-year-old Shauna Appletons and 22-year-old Kevin Paulus. Ronald went to their door, knocked on it, and then put a gun in their face and forced them inside their own vehicle. He had them drive to a remote location where he then shot both of them in the head. And it's believed at some point, whether it was before or after, he sexually assaulted Shauna. Ronald was arrested just 2 days after their bodies were found. There essentially was witnesses, and evidence would lead right to him. While in custody, he admitted to all the murders. He also admitted to committing 5 other sexual assaults, and he went on trial in 2011 and was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and the reason for his jump in behavior appears to be unknown. There would be so many opportunities to arrest this man to prevent him from doing what he did. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of serial killer Westley Allan Dodd. Viewer discretion strongly advised. This one's bad. Westley was born on July 3rd, 1961 and lived in Toppenish, Washington. He apparently had a relatively normal childhood, which is unusual for serial killers. He would later say that he never was told "I love you" and he never said "I love you" to his family, but that was really the worst of it, I guess. When he was about 13 years old, he began to become an early sexual predator. He would expose himself to young children in the neighborhood. His parents just ignored it. Then in his high school years, he began to molest younger people, including his own family members. When he was 15, he was arrested for indecent exposure, and that's it. But then he just got a slap on the wrist. He attempted to kidnap a couple of girls when he was about 20 years old. They went to police, but police said, they did nothing. He then enrolled in the Navy, where he molested children on the base in Bangor, Washington. He also offered children $50 to play strip poker with him. He would actually be arrested, and he confessed that he was planning to molest them. Police did nothing. They let him go. The Navy would discharge him, and then shortly after that, in 1984, he was arrested for molesting a child, but he got a suspended sentence, which means he spent no time in jail. He then began to molest the children of one of his neighbors. The neighbor, the mother, didn't press charges against him because she didn't want her children to go through the trauma. Unfucking-believable. On September 4th, 1989, he would get in his vehicle and he would drive to a nearby park in Vancouver, Washington. And when he got there, he found two young boys that he felt he could lure away. 11-year-old Cole Neer and 10-year-old William Neer, brothers. He tied them to a tree where he then sexually assaulted both of them repeatedly, and then he stabbed them both to death. And their bodies would be discovered shortly after. On October 29th, 1989, he drove to Portland, Oregon, where he found 4-year-old Lee Oselli. He managed to lure him away, brought him to his apartment where he tied him up to this bed with restraints, and sexually assaulted him over the course of the evening. He then strangled the 4-year-old boy to death and hid his body in this closet. He was arrested in November of 1989 after he got caught trying to lure another boy away. In 1990, he would be convicted of the 3 murders and received the death penalty, where he requested to be hanged. He was executed in 1993. He would be paroled after committing a murder, and then history would repeat itself. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Donald Beardslee. Viewer discretion is advised. Donald was born on May 13th, 1943 in St. Louis, Missouri. Uh-oh, I said it funny. His father would die when he was 11, and he was actually sent to military school at a relatively young age, around 15. And then eventually, he would become a member of the U.S. Air Force. Eventually, that wouldn't go so well for him either. He was in the Air Force for about 4 years, but he would end up committing Grand Theft Auto and would be discharged. And also, as part of his conviction for stealing the vehicle, he was then forced to work on a farm in Minnesota. While working on the farm, he did have a traumatic experience when he was cutting down a tree and one of those big old branches fell and smacked him right on the head. And it is believed that this did cause some permanent brain damage, and it would come up later in his life as sort of an excuse for doing what he would do. Now, fast forward to 1969, he had moved back to Missouri, and one night he met a woman by the name of Laura Griffin in a bar. The two of them had some drinks, they were chatting, they even danced the night away. She would then invite him back to her home for, and then Laura would be found dead. She had been stabbed, and he also drowned her. He confessed to it right away. And he pled guilty, second-degree murder, and he got a 19-year sentence. But in 1977, he was paroled. He was only locked up for 7 years for the brutal murder of Laura Griffin. After he was released, he moved to California. He had befriended some drug dealers, one of them named Frank Rutherford, and the other named Ricarda Soria. 19-year-old Patty Getting and 23-year-old Stacy Benjamin. Apparently, the two of them had purchased drugs from Frank Rutherford. But also, allegedly, there was a $185 debt that the ladies, I guess, didn't pay. So Frank, he wanted to get revenge, so he lured them to his apartment. They duct-taped the hands of both girls, and Donald and Frank took turns shooting Patty to death. And then Donald took a knife and he slit the throat of Stacy. They then disposed of their bodies. When they were found, police found evidence linking Donald to the murders, and he confessed again. Now, Frank Rutherford got life in prison, but Donald, because he was still on parole, was given the death penalty. They tried to say his brain injury caused him to do it. Didn't work. He died in 2005. This is a haunted house of sorts, the walls which have seen some horrific things. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of my accountant, Herbert Richard Baumeister. Viewer discretion is advised. Herb, as many people called him, was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. He grew up in a relatively normal household, nothing typical of like a serial killer, but his father would say that they tried to have him see a psychologist. And at one point, he was diagnosed as being schizophrenic, but later on in life, he wasn't really being treated for it. He would go on to marry Juliana, who went by Julie, and they would end up having some kids. I swear to God, he just looks like he should be selling me insurance. But shit, this dude was evil. Now, in the 90s, several men, gay men specifically, would suddenly go missing. These are 8 of those men. After a fun night of drinking at a bar, they would all go missing one at a time. A man named Tony Harris would come forward in the mid-90s to tell police a very interesting story. He said that he interacted with a man who was calling himself Brian Smart, who claimed to kill the man's friend. And then this Brian Smart person tried to kill Tony. Tony says that this Mr. Smart tried to use a pool hose to strangle him from behind. But it didn't work and Tony got away. One day, Tony just so happened to notice Brian Smart. So he began to pursue him in his vehicle. He took down his license plate number, which Tony would then give to police, which would then come back to Mr. Herb Baumeister. The seemingly gentle, friendly, neighborly man who then police would find out that was kind of a facade. He had anger issues, his wife would tell them. He was a perfectionist who was always trying to impress people or one-up people. He was successful though. He and his wife co-owned a chain of stores called Save-A-Lot. But brewing underneath was an absolute monster. Now, Herb and his family lived here on a property called Fox Hollow Farm. After his wife finally divorced him, she would actually give permission to police to search the property. And well, when they did, they found some shit. They would uncover the remains of 12 men. 8 of them were identified. These were 8 of those 12 men. Now, when they searched the property, Herb was conveniently out of town, but he caught wind of the bodies being discovered. So Herb fled to Ontario, Canada, where he then shot himself in the head and died, never having to suffer the consequences. He lured the men to his pool, have sex with them, then strangle them to death. He may also be the I-70 killer. Hello, God, true crimeers, I'm sorry you had to see this. This is the case of a mullet, otherwise known as William Devin Howell. Viewer discretion is advised. Oh, raspberries. Okay. William was born on February 11th, 1970. He was born in Hampton, Virginia, but he would also make Connecticut sort of like a home as well. I really can't find much about his upbringing without reading a book about him. But as an adult, he was known by his acquaintances as just a really hard worker. He did landscaping. He was always doing like little odd jobs here and there for people. Drug use did become an issue in his life as well that would actually see him get some jail time. He would also later go on to say that he had fantasies of sexually assaulting women. Eventually, those fantasies would become reality. Drive around in the alternate timeline mystery machine, a van he would call the Murder Mobile. And in the van, he would become Connecticut's most vile, infamous serial killer. In 2003, 7 individuals would go missing. Melanie Camellini, Janice Roberts, Diane Cusack, Nilsa Arizmendi, Marilyn Gonzalez, Joyveline Martinez, and Mary Menard. Some of these women had issues with drugs and substance abuse. So essentially, most of them were people that just unfortunately didn't get noticed. In April 2004, Williams... Do you notice how they're always named William? Anyway, Williams' murder mobile would be pulled over by police for a routine stop. This is because a witness would say that William was seen with one of the victims, and that was Nilsa Arizmendi. Police would seize the van, and inside the van they would uncover bloodstains. They would rip up cushions and notice more blood underneath that. When they tested the blood, it was a 99% match to Nilsa. So William was arrested, and he would eventually be charged with her murder. He would take an Alford plea for manslaughter because there was no body at the time. And then a body would be uncovered here behind a strip mall, something William would basically call his secret garden. Eventually, all of the bodies would be found there. It would be revealed, and this is disgusting, William's first victim was Melanie Camellini. She was a 29-year-old mother of two. When he killed her, he strangled her. He slept with her body in his van for 2 weeks. Yeah. He would go on to plead guilty to all of the murders. And William Howell was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, 0 possibilities of parole. He would call himself the Sick Ripper. Y'all like my new hair? Anyway, hello, true crimerers. This is the case of serial killer David Edwin Mason. Viewer discretion is advised. And unfortunately, you're going to be stuck looking at this mug the entire video because I cannot find pictures of anything or anyone else. Davey Boy here was born on December 2nd, 1956 in Statesboro, Georgia. And he, fun fact, is not a peach. This may come as a shocker, but David, he wasn't wanted. Yeah, very rare that happens with serial killers. The family would move to California shortly after he was born, and he, along with his 7 other siblings, were always being beaten and physically abused. The parents tried to raise all the kids as fundamentalist Pentecostals, but for them, and David especially, it wasn't really their cup of tea. When he was 5 years old, he actually tried to end his own life. At an early age, he also started to show signs of violence. Like one time, he woke up in the middle of the night, grabbed a knife, and stood over his brother in bed, but he was stopped from doing anything by his father. Eventually, they would lock him in his room all the time. They would install those big, great iron bars on his windows so he couldn't escape, and they referred to that room as the dungeon. Throughout his life, he tried to end his own life many times, always failing. The man even set himself on fire once, yeah. And there are at least 6 people who probably wish he was successful. He would first start his life of crime by petty thefts, stealing from people. He entered himself into prostitution. He would do odd jobs, especially for the elderly, including working for a 73-year-old woman by the name of Joan Picard. She was known to have a collection of rare coins and had some money on her person at all times. On March 6, 1980, he would break into her home, and he would disable her alarm because he knew the code because she trusted him with it. His plan was just to steal the coins and money, but she got in the way. So he would strangle her to death to leave no witnesses. He successfully pawned the coins for some good money, and then on August 18, 1980, he met up with 83-year-old Arthur Jennings, an older homosexual man who he had some interactions with. Again, intent on robbing him, he strangled the man to death, and he stole $16 and a ring. That's it. November 16th, 1980, he broke into the home of 75-year-old Antoinette Brown. He beat and strangled her to death and stole whatever money she had. December 6th, 1980, he murdered 72-year-old Dorothy Lang, just for a couple of valuables that she had. He would be arrested on January 6, 1981. He would then confess to murdering a gay lover of his in the past, among the 4 other people he killed, and while in prison he murdered an inmate. He would be executed in 1993. A New Hampshire man would lose his f***ing mind one day. This is like something from a movie. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Carl Drega. Viewer discretion is advised. Carl here was born on January 19th, 1935, and, well, he was just a negative Nancy. He had a really difficult time just getting along with the US government, and he had a major issue with authority. And thank God a man like that owned a whole bunch of guns. Way back in 1981, he had a major issue with his property that he owned, but there was a dispute over what he was allowed to do and not allowed to do, but he did the thing he wasn't allowed to do anyway. Then fast forward to 1995 when a town judge, Vicky Bonnell, she went to Drega's property about a dispute. And that conversation ended pretty abruptly when Carl Drega took out a gun and shot it into the air. Something that prompted Vicky to then purchase her own gun and have it on her at all times. On August 19th, 1997, Carl would go to a local supermarket when State Trooper Scott Phillips pulled him over in the parking lot to say that his vehicle had too much rust on it. I honestly did not know that was a thing. So Carl, always being the calm, cool, and collected gentleman that he is, took out a rifle and shot Trooper Phillips. The trooper didn't die. He instead ran to a field where, from about 150 feet away this time, shot his rifle again at Officer Phillips, this time killing him. Right around that same time, another state trooper, Leslie Lord, pulls into the parking lot where Carl Drega sees him. Before the officer could do anything, Carl fires a round into him, killing him before he can even get out of his car. Carl then steals the first state trooper's car and takes off, where he then goes to the News Sentinel building, which is a shared building with the office of Vicky Bunnell. He has a grudge. She sees him coming and warns everyone, "Oh my God, Carl's here with a gun, run, run, run." Carl notices this, and from about 30 feet away, he fires a round into her back, killing her. Now, at some point, Carl falls down when the editor of the News and Sentinel, Dennis Juice, he tries to stop Carl, but he does not get there in time. Carl, from the ground, fires a round into Dennis, killing him. Carl goes back to his house and sets it on fire just for funsies, and his little day of fun is almost over. He gets back into the state trooper car, where he drives through roadblocks shooting random officers, not fatally this time, where eventually they're able to corner him near Vermont. A shootout occurs, and Carl Drega is shot dead. This guy looks like he would try to sell you some insurance, but he would claim he was a hitman for the mob. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Richard Kuklinski, otherwise known as the Iceman. Little Dickie Kuklinski here was born in Jersey City, New Jersey in 1935. I think horse and carriage was still the main transportation then. He grew up in the typical serial killer of the future type household. Alcoholic father who would abuse the crap out of the kids, super religious mother who would also abuse the kids. He would eventually marry Barbara here, and they would go on to have a happy little American family. And then, he would begin to dabble in small crimes. Richie would make bootleg copies of movies and sell them. Not just regular mainstream movies, but he would also do that with pornographic film. And this actually made him a pretty steady profit. This would lead to him starting his own little gang. I don't think they had like a name, but it was just a little group of people who would burglarize. On January 30th, 1980, he would commit his first murder. A man by the name of George Malaband would agree to meet Richard to purchase some tapes, and on his person, he had about $27,000. A week later, George Malaband's body was found inside of a 55-gallon drum. Later on, it would be found out that Richard shot him 5 times and stole his money. By the way, I apologize, I can't find any pictures of the actual people he killed. But now in 1982, he would meet up with a man by the name of Paul Hoffman. He went to meet Richard to purchase some prescription drugs in order to then sell them for his own profit. He brought with him $25,000. Richard tried to shoot him, but his gun jammed, so he ended up beating him to death and then put his body in a 55-gallon drum as well. Where he left the drum, he said he went back a couple of days later and the drum was gone. So Paul Hoffman's body has never been found, even though he would later admit to killing him. In 1982, he would finally kill one of his own gang members, Gary Smith, because he assumed Gary had turned into an informant. He tried lacing a hamburger of Gary's with cyanide, but that took too long, so eventually he was strangled to death. His body was disposed of underneath a mattress in a hotel room. It took several days and several different people sleeping in that room to find the body. In 1983, he would then kill another one of his gang members, Daniel Deppner, for virtually the same reason as Gary Smith. When that body was found, it was believed he was poisoned by cyanide. The body of another man by the name of Louis Masquet was discovered in 1983, but he went missing in 1981. The last time Louis was seen was trying to meet Richard Kuklinski to purchase some tapes. He had about $90,000 on his person. Louis was shot in the back of the head, and then Richard froze his body A couple of years later, when he went to dispose the body, he didn't wait to thaw it out, so he just dumped the body, and he was found partially thawed. This is why Richard would become known as the Iceman, because it's believed he stored the other bodies in a freezer for at least a little bit of time, and he did so in this garage here. Now, police were under the impression that these 5 murders were done by the same person. And one of Richard's former gang members, employees, whatever you would want to call him, he would become an informant for the police. And the authorities would then begin Operation Iceman. Finally, in December of 1986, Richard was caught when he was trying to sell cyanide to an undercover officer working on Operation Iceman. Richard would confess to the 5 murders, but he didn't just stop there. You see, Richard said he wasn't just some crazy serial killer. No. He worked for the mob. Yeah, that's what he said. He claims that he was working with all 5 major mob families in the Jersey area, and that he was hired to kill hundreds of people. He would use cyanide, he would use guns, he would strangle people, he would beat people, he would do whatever he needed to do to kill off these mob targets. The mob members who he claims he worked with, they would go, who the fuck is this Kuklinski guy? Never fucking heard of the dude. And these are people who weren't exactly hiding anything, once they were caught or investigated or whatever the case may be. But whenever asked about Richard, they all just said, no, never fucking heard of him. So there is a lot of debate on whether or not he truly did work for the mob and killed a lot more people. Or was Richard Kuklinski, pictured here, just a sad little man who just didn't really know how to truly exist in the happy little family he had going on? All this man ever knew from his own childhood was violence. He claims he killed one of his own brothers, and there really isn't much debate to that. One of his other brothers also went on to become a sexual assaulter and a murderer. Seems like it runs in the family. So no, there is no genuine validation that he worked for the mob. Ultimately, he was just a sick serial killer who killed people because he wanted money. So he went on trial for the 5 murders, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. In March of 2006, he would die of Kawasaki disease. He was 70 years old. A man walks into this home in Easley, South Carolina, holds 2 women hostage, and ends up taking his own life. Who was he and how did we get here? Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Dallen Bounds. Viewer discretion is advised. On June 26, 1999, this Greenville, South Carolina Radio Shack would become a crime scene. When a customer tried to go inside, the lights were turned off and the close sign was flipped over. Initially, when the customer walked in, he noticed that the register's till was open and it was emptied. But there were no signs of any employees and it was completely dark. When the customer walked to the back room, he noticed there was blood on the floor, and when he peered over the other direction, the body of Radio Shack employee Jonathan Lemuel was found. Jonathan was actually tied up to a chair and he had blood all over him. When police arrived, they noticed that there was a bloody screwdriver and that his wounds, well, he was stabbed in the neck repeatedly. But police did not know who did this. We'll come back to this in a little bit. On December 22nd, 1999, here at this flower shop in Greenville, South Carolina. Same exact situation. The lights were all off, the close sign was flipped over, and a delivery driver was expecting to be able to get in there. When he walked in, no one was around, it was dark, there was an empty till, and then when he walked to the back room, the body of 30-year-old Karen Hayden was found face down on the ground. She was killed by having her throat cut. Right as that investigation is starting to take off, the very next day, another murder. A woman by the name of Sandra Ott was found murdered in her home. She had been shot to death. Police initially suspected that it was her husband, Timothy Ott, but then he was found shot dead outside of a neighbor's home. It appeared he was running to get help. Later that same day, here in this home, a woman and her grandmother were just watching television when all of a sudden, a man just walks in, sits down, and starts watching TV with them. They have no idea who he is. It would later be revealed that it was 28-year-old Dallen Bounds. He was on the run from the police because he had just killed 2 people the same morning, Sandra and Timothy Ott. He held the 2 women hostage in the home, where police finally found him. Realizing he was surrounded, he took the gun that he had, put it to his own head, and pulled the trigger. He was friends with the Otts, so that's why police had suspected him. He was a known acquaintance of theirs. But it wouldn't be until a week after he died where his roommate said he also killed the Radio Shack employee. He also killed the flower shop employee. The roommate was arrested and charged with accessory after the fact for not telling anyone. But why did Dallen do it? He's dead, so no one knows. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Daniel Hittle. Viewer discretion is advised. There isn't a ton of information about his early years. I do know that he was born in 1950 in Indiana, but he was actually adopted into a new family pretty early on in his life. He would be adopted by Henry and Margaret Hittle, and they lived in the little town of Motley, Minnesota. And they all ended up living on a little farm. It's not this one, but I couldn't find a picture of it. Now, his adopted mother, Margaret, was deeply, deeply religious, and that is something that did not sit well with Daniel. He found it to be a bit much, and so he didn't really get along with her that well. As he got older, he would become an alcoholic, and he would also go into the world of drugs. On April 4th, 1973, he got into an argument with his adopted mother, not about religion, but about their dog. He claims that their dog scratched his truck. Oh no. So at one point, he goes into the house, retrieves a shotgun, comes back outside, and shoots Margaret as she's standing in the doorway. His adopted father, Henry, hearing this, goes out, tries to retrieve his gun, but before he can do anything, Daniel shoots him dead as well. Now, a neighbor heard and saw the whole thing, so they had already called police, and when police got there, they just promptly arrested Daniel. Daniel would end up pleading guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, and he was convicted and sentenced. Now, he received a 30-year sentence for each murder, and they were to run concurrently, but because of a bill that had passed around that same time, people who were convicted and sentenced to longer than 20 years could be eligible for parole before their minimum term. Meaning if someone is sentenced to 20 years to life, they can actually go for parole before they hit that 20 years. And that is exactly what happened with Daniel Hittle. He was paroled in 1984, where he then moved to Texas. Fun! In Texas, he would find himself a drug dealer named Mary Goss. Well, they constantly argued. She always called the cops on him, and I guess he just got super pissed off one day. On November 15th, 1989, he would get into his vehicle and drive towards the Goss house. On the way, he was stopped by a police officer for speeding. 48-year-old Officer Gerald Walker pulled him over, and it was the last thing he would ever do. Daniel took out his shotgun he had in his truck and shot the officer dead. He then sped off towards the Goss house, his drug dealer's house. When he arrived, he immediately shot and killed Mary Goss, 2 of her friends that were there, Richard Cook and Raymond Gregg, and Mary's 4-year-old daughter. He was arrested, convicted, and executed. This is Jiminy Glick. No, it's not. This is Genene Jones, and she's a kumquat. Jones was a licensed vocational nurse at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio. She worked in the pediatric department, and when a very high number of infants were dying, the hospital just asked her and all of the LVNs to resign. And then the hospital never pursued anything legal about why this was going on. She then took a job at a pediatrics clinic in Kerrville, Texas. While she was there, she was caught poisoning 6 children with succinylcholine, which is typically used as a general anesthetic and causes temporary paralysis. In an infant, it causes cardiac arrest. In 1985, she was sentenced to 99 years in prison for the murder of 15-month-old baby Chelsea McClellan, and then later was sentenced to 60 more years for the murder of baby Rolando Santos. She gone. Hello, true crimerers. Let's talk about a serial killer, shall we? This mustachioed fella is Robert Berdella. You're welcome for that rhyme. Bobbert here was born on January 31st, 1949. and later on in his life, he would be affectionately known as the Kansas City Butcher. Nice! At 1982, Bob here would begin renting his own booth at the Westport Flea Market, which he would call Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. Oh, Bob, there's your trademark humor. He would sell art, jewelry, antiques, but he sucked at it and he didn't make much money. While working at the flea market, he met a gentleman named Paul Howell, which would then help Bob become acquainted with Paul's son, Jerry Howell. Jerry and his friends would originally make fun of Bob for his homosexuality. Hey, that's not nice. But later on, Jerry would confide a lot in Bob Berdella. Well, it wouldn't turn out good for Jerry in the end. On July 5th, 1984, Bob Berdella abducted Jerry Howell under some promise that he was taking him to some dance thing. He filled Jerry with alcohol, Valium, and acepromazine, which I'm not sure what that is. He then put a horse tranquilizer in him and then tied him to Bob's bed. And over the course of about 28 to 30 hours, Bob would continually drug him, assault him, sexually assault him, and Jerry would pass away from what Bob described as asphyxiating on his own vomit, or a combination of all the drugs being too much. He then dismembered Jerry and put him into several trash bags and threw him in the garbage. Bob Berdella would keep detailed notes and files about each victim he would go on to do the same thing to, including the times he administered drugs, the exact time he committed sexual assaults, in his very clean room. It's really fucking with my OCD. Besides, this would become an unfortunate pattern for Bob Berdella, as he would do the same exact thing to 23-year-old Robert Sheldon, who was just seeking shelter, and then rinse and repeat with a man named Mark Wallace. He would suffocate some of his victims. He would torture them by putting bleach down their throats, putting knives under their fingernails. Then again to a man named James Ferris, who Bob We Oughta Baby Eats the Boy Berdella claimed he was especially brutal with. Then a previous acquaintance of his, Todd Stoops, a 23-year-old, who was a drug addict and a prostitute. He would do all the same things to him, except for Stoops, he held him captive for much longer. Larry Wayne Pearson would become his sixth and final victim, at least of murder. On March 29, 1988, 22-year-old Christopher Bryson would escape his clutches after he was abducted, which finally led to his arrest. In 1988, he pled guilty and got 5 life sentences, and died of a heart attack in 1992. This is the spree-killing case of Yosemite Ronald Gene Simmons. Varmint. Simmons was born on July 15, 1940. Oh, you sure about that? More like 1840. Later on in life, he would go on to have a 20-year military service career. In 1960, he married his wife Rebecca, and they went on to have 7 children. Really? With him? On April 3rd, 1981, Simmons here, he's a creep. He was being investigated for fathering a child with his 17-year-old daughter, who he was actually sexually assaulting. And being the stand-up guy that he is, he fled to Arkansas with his whole family. Over the years in Arkansas, he would work several jobs, and on December 18th, 1987, he would quit his job at the Sinclair Mini Mart, which just so happens to be the time he decided he was going to murder his entire family. On December 22nd, 1987, he would begin his killing spree by murdering his wife Rebecca and his eldest son Gene by shooting them with a .22 caliber pistol. He then strangled his 3-year-old granddaughter Barbara. Oh, by the way, he dumped all the bodies in a cesspit that he actually made all of the kids dig days prior. Simmons then waited for the other kids to come home. He told them, I have Christmas presents to give you, but I want to give them to you individually. So he then killed his 17-year-old daughter, Loretta, by strangling her and also drowning her in a rain barrel. He then did the same thing to 14-year-old Eddie, 11-year-old Marianne, and 8-year-old Becky. He then decided to take a little breaksy poo for a couple of days, when on December 26, 1987, the rest of his family would then come to his home, where he then shot his 22-year-old son, Billy, and then his 21-year-old daughter-in-law, Renata, and then he drowned his 20-month-old grandson, William. By the way, I'm just showing random pictures behind me of the family. They're not necessarily lining up with the people I'm saying. Next, he shot and killed his 24-year-old daughter, Sheila. Then he shot 33-year-old son-in-law, Dennis. He then strangled his 6-year-old daughter/granddaughter, Sylvia. He then strangled his 21-month-old grandson, Michael. And then on December 28th, he drove into a little town called Russellville. He walked into a law office, and he then just shot and murdered the receptionist working there, Kathy Kendrick. He apparently had a weird little obsession with her. He then went to an oil company, where he shot and murdered a man named J.D., shot and wounded a man named Rusty. He then drove to a convenience store where he worked before, and shot and wounded 2 more people. He then went to a freight company, and shot and wounded a woman. He then sat and waited for police to get him. He was charged with 16 counts of murder, and received 16 death penalties, and was executed on June 25th, 1990. Hi, let's talk about a serial killer. This lovely creep is Wayne Adam Ford. He was born on December 31st, 1961 in Petaluma, California. When Ford was 2 years old, he fell off a step and he really hit his head hard. Later down the road, when he was 18 years old, he was hit by a drunk driver and suffered a major head injury. These head injuries allegedly changed his personality and created some pretty insane impulses. So he was in and out of mental health institutions for some time. He would eventually be diagnosed with a severe case of borderline personality disorder. He had been arrested for beating prostitutes, beating animals, and having sexual relations with a 15-year-old. He served in the Marine Corps for 6 years before being honorably discharged in 1985. In 1994, he married his second wife, Elizabeth, and they went on to have a son together. In 1996, she filed for divorce, and she also won full custody of their son, Max. Well, this is when Ford snapped. On October 17, 1997, he picked up a sex worker that would only ever be known as Jane Doe. He sexually assaulted her, murdered her, and dismembered her. A couple months later, he picked up another prostitute named Tina Gibbs. He strangled her to death and disposed of her body. And by the way, here's 3 of his 4 victims. His third victim was Lynette White. She was walking into a grocery store in Ontario, and he just took her. Her body would be discovered in a canal a little bit later on. And then he would go on to murder a woman named Patricia Temez. This is when Ford began to have thoughts of offing himself. On November 3rd, 1998, he had a phone call with his brother. He said, "I did some really, really bad things." And his brother said, "All right, you need to turn yourself in." So the next day, Wayne and his brother Calvin, they went into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department, where Wayne would remove a plastic bag from his pocket containing a woman's severed breast. He said he was very sorry, but that he did it because he was very mad at his wife. He would tell them, "You know what? I'm thinking about killing my wife, and I don't want to do that to my son. So I'm going to go ahead and just say, let's end this now." What a guy! Well, he was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Go figure. He was convicted of all these charges and was sentenced to death. He is currently still incarcerated, awaiting his execution. You a sick bitch, bud. Okay, great, bye. Oh my God. Oh, Jesus. Hello. This is the case of Derrick Todd Lee. Can I get a human picture of him? Oh, there we go, dearie. That's more like it. Don't give me that sassy look. You're the murderer. Bitch-ass punk. Derrick here was also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Geraldine DeSoto was one of his first victims. Typically, Derrick would enter the home some way, somehow that no one really knows for sure, but they do know there was never any forced entry into any of his victims' homes. He would steal their cell phones and all of their belongings, at least the ones that he could take. He would then sexually assault them and then murder them. He did the same thing to Charlotte Murray Pace. Now, these 2 women are the 2 women he would be tried for their murders. He would be convicted of first-degree murder for the death of DeSoto. He got life without the possibility of parole. For Charlotte Pace, he would also be convicted of first-degree murder, and for her death, he was sentenced to death. His DNA also connected him to the murder of Gina Green, Pam Kinamore, Trinisha Dean Colomb, Carrie Lynn Yoder, and his only living victim, Diane Alexander, where he entered her home, he beat the living crap out of her, and then attempted to sexually assault her before her son came in and chased Derrick Todd Lee out of the house. He obviously tried to catch him, but he couldn't, but the son was able to get enough of a description of him to a sketch artist. Which is kind of where this is where that comes from. Okay, bye. I don't know why that picture is so scary. His killing spree went from 1992 to 2003 when he was eventually caught. The biggest wrench in the case was a profiler said that the killer of these women would actually be a white male. So all of the DNA they collected, all of the suspects they questioned and interrogated were all white. It wasn't until they started using the genealogy DNA testing to realize that there was an 85% chance that the killer was African American. And then eventually the DNA was matched to Derrick Todd Lee. He was actually arrested in Atlanta, Georgia, and then was extradited back to Baton Rouge, where he then went on trial for the two women's murders. We already talked about that. Derrick also had an extremely low IQ of about 65. His lawyers tried to use that to say he couldn't stand trial, but that didn't work. Even though he was sentenced to death, it would never happen, because on January 21st, 2016, he died of heart disease. Wah wah. Hello, true crimers. It is the return of most infamous serial killers, but this time, we're going international. We're going to explore the world and find out who's the deadliest son of a bee from each country. And today we're starting with Costa Rica. Be prepared for me to butcher several names. Costa Rica's top creep is Adrian Javier Arroyo Gutierrez. I probably said those all wrong, but that just sounded fancy as shit. He was also known as the Southern Psychopath. All of his victims would be women of the night, if you want to sound, fancy about it. He specifically searched for women who would exchange sexual acts for drugs. He would then lure them into a quiet, desolate location. He would then sexually assault them and then strangle them to death. When he was done, he would pose the bodies with the woman's legs hunched up, and he would put leaves over their private area. April 10th, 2015, they found the decomposing body of Natalia Salazar Flores. June 24th, 2015, they found the body of a homeless woman whose name is not known. July 14th, 2015, in San Sebastian, they would find the body of 27-year-old Elisa Carmona. July 26, 2015, in Hatillo, they would find the body of Tanya Barrantes, and she appeared to have been beaten as well. And then on August 6, 2015, in Sagrada Familia, they found the body of an unnamed woman there. So these 6 murders that I just listed were the ones that he would be charged with and he would go to trial for. But it is believed he killed up to 11 women in the same fashion in relatively the same area. So Costa Rican authorities would then begin working with the local prostitutes in the area. They would offer them safety and protection in exchange for information. One woman revealed that she was sexually assaulted and attacked by a man resembling what they think Arroyo looked like, and she had actually seen him with 3 of the victims, and this all led to his arrest. They then took his DNA and they matched it to the DNA left at the crime scenes, and they were a perfect match. It also linked him to several sexual assaults where the victims didn't die. So he was brought to trial, and he was convicted of 6 of the murders and 2 additional sexual assaults. Now, he would get a 110-year sentence, but Costa Rican law only allows them to serve a maximum of 50 years. But if it's any consolation, he would be about 90 years old at the end of that sentence. And that's that. You love true crime, I love true crime, and that's why we can't trust anyone. Stay safe. Hey, true crimers. You smell that? It smells like old fried fish. Blech. Can I help you, sir? What the fuck? This sweet old man is Albert Fish. Huh? He's not sweet? Oh. He was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19th, 1870? Damn, you're old as shit. Holy crap, his dad was 75 when he was born. I thought you were just shooting out dust at that age. Well, the Fish family had a history of mental illness, and this boomer was no exception. In 1890, he moved to New York when he was 20 years old, where he claims he became a prostitute, where he began sexually assaulting young boys. Oh, no, but that's not what prostitution is. By 1898, he was married to a woman his mother set him up with, and those two ended up having 6 kids together. Even during all of this, he said he still continued molesting little children. under the age of 6 usually. In 1903, he was convicted of grand larceny and was incarcerated in Sing Sing prison. Sing Sing sounds like a fun fucking place, you know? In 1910, he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden, where they began having a sadomasochistic relationship, in which eventually good old Albert here began to torture him. And, he cut off half of Thomas's... Woohoo! He almost gave him a full, like, Theon Greyjoy, wink wink. In 1917, his wife left him. Gee, I wonder why. Apparently this pushed him over the edge, where I thought he was already falling off the edge, but I guess this was it, right here. He would begin self-harming by embedding needles into his groin and abdomen. This is the actual x-ray of his pelvis. He had 29 needles lodged into his pelvic area. He also struck himself with a nail-studded paddle, and also put wool doused with lighter fluid up his butt and lit it on fire. Hey bud, are you good, or? Okay. In 1919, he would stab a mentally disabled boy, and then he just kept it going. He would torture and mutilate mentally disabled people or African Americans because he claimed that no one would miss them. Then in 1928, he kidnapped and murdered Grace Budd, a 10-year-old. An anonymous letter was written to Grace's parents, claiming the murder and also that he ate parts of her, and the police, through some good sleuthing, traced the envelope back to Albert Fish. When he was arrested, he also confessed to the murder of Frances McDonald, a 9-year-old, and also the murder of 12-year-old Billy Gaffney. He's suspected to have murdered up to 8 people, but he was only convicted for 3 murders. January 16th, 1936, when he was 65, he was fried. Wah, wah, wah.
Hello, true crime peoples, yes? It is time for episode 2 of Famous Serial Killers International, yes? As you can tell by my accent today, we are going to Greenland, yes? No. It is Russia. And who from Russia likes to slicey and dicey the peoples? This is everybody's father from Russia, Andrei Chikatilo, yes? We love him, he is a great man. Please, stop accent and speak like normal person.
Okay. Andrei here was also known as the Butcher of Rostov, or the Forest Strip Killer, or the Red Ripper, or the Rostov Ripper. Jesus, any more fucking names? God. He committed most of his murders in the Rostov Oblast of the Russian SFSR. Oh, aren't you fun? He was born on October 16th, 1936. By age 14, he was considered a big ol' communist. Go figure. By 1957, he was serving in the Soviet Army. In 1963, someone married this handsome fella. Her name was Feodosia Odnacheva. Again, I have no idea. And by 1970, he began a teaching career. Well, and his teaching career would not be very good. You want to know why? Because he began sexually assaulting his pupils. Yeah, that tends to end teaching careers, or any career, or, lives. He got in trouble, and he was able to resign secretly, and his teaching career officially ended in 1981, when there were just way too many cases of molestation of children, from both boys and girls. In September of 1978, he murdered his first known victim, 9-year-old Yelena Zakotonova. Andrei rented a desolate home for the purpose of doing these things. He tried to assault her sexually, but he couldn't salute the sailor. She tried to flee when this happened, and then he choked her and stabbed her. And that is when he was able to go to completion, when he was stabbing her. That's disgusting. This is an area where some bodies would be found. By September 1981, he had murdered 17-year-old Larisa Kachenko. He then killed 12-year-old Yubov Bayruk. I am really bad at these names, sorry. In 1983, he murdered 14-year-old Sergei Markov. Let's just say the pattern continues, and he has a guaranteed confirmed number of 52 murder victims, primarily all children. He was arrested in 1984, but because of theft from one of his employers, and then he was released after a year. And after he was released, he of course killed more children. He would be officially apprehended for the murders in 1990, and was charged with sexual abuse, sexual assault, aggravated murder, and he would be sentenced to death. And in 1994, he was executed by firing squad.
Bloody hell, that's a face for you. Yes, it's me, your resident Aussie true crimerer, and today we're talking about Ivan Milat. Between 1989 and 1993, Milat was responsible for the deaths of 2 men and 5 women in New South Wales. By the time the first of his victims was discovered in 1993, several backpackers had already been reported missing in and around the Belangolo State Forest area. But that discovery sparked a massive manhunt that lasted well over a year. Police were eventually tipped off to Milat by a potential former victim of his, sparked a massive 6-month surveillance operation. Milat was eventually arrested and charged with all 7 murders in 1994, convicted to 7 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence right to the end. And in 2019, he died of stomach cancer, taking his confession to the grave with him.
Hey, true crimers, this is the case of holy shit, she needs a doctor, she's got gray disease. Oh, it's just a black and white photo. Sometimes I'm an idiot. This is Terri Rachals, and even if she did need a doctor, one place I suggest she should never go is the Phoebe Putney Memorial Hospital in Georgia. Ooh, 2-star review, not very good. Why can't she go there? Let's backtrack a bit. Terri Rachel was born in 1961, and by 1986 she was a 25-year-old nurse and also a Karen. And she was working at, you guessed it, Phoebe Putney Hospital. Jesus Christ, where have you been? In 1986, several of her patients would, what's that word? Die. You see, she was working in the intensive care unit of Phoebe Putney, and cardiac arrests in the ICU were becoming very, very normal. So the administrators began looking into it. They uncovered 6 suspicious deaths, and even more near deaths. So they quietly, hushly notified police. And through checking records, it didn't take them very long to point all of those deaths to Miss Terri Rachals. She had been injecting potassium chloride into her patients, which then caused cardiac arrest, which then led to their deaths. She is another one of those angels of death type killers. She would eventually give a taped confession to Georgian detectives. And in 1986, she went on trial for 6 murders. Now, at her trial, a psychiatrist who treated her basically said that because Terri suffered from chronic depression, a hysteric personality, and a dissociative disorder, those things caused her to slip into a fugue state. And this is when she carried out her acts of murder without her really knowing about it. Oh, Jesus. Yeah, hi, I suffer from depression and PTSD. The thoughts never crossed my mind. The prosecution would say that Terri basically felt like a second-class citizen her whole adult life, and that she desired power and control. And I guess she obtained this by murdering patients. On September 26, 1986, a jury found her guilty, but mentally ill. And they only found her guilty on 1 count of aggravated assault. And they found her not guilty on every other charge, including all the murder charges. And she was sentenced to 17 years in prison, plus a 3-year probation period afterwards. And after serving her full 17-year sentence, she was released in 2003. 17 years. For murdering at least 6 people, but probably more. Great. It's time for another episode of International Serial Killers. Today we're traveling to South Africa. So, who is one of South Africa's worst serial killers? He's known as the ABC Killer because he started killing in the state of Atteridgeville, then went to Boksburg, then killed in Cleveland in South Africa. I had no idea. He's also known as the South African Strangler. And his name is Moses Shithole. Sithole. Sithole. Moses Sithole. My apologies, you piece of shit. Oh. Moses here was born on November 17th, 1964, in Vosloorus. You all know I'm going to mispronounce so many names on this international series. His father died when he was 5, and his mother just picked up and abandoned the whole family, which means him and his siblings had to live in and out of orphanages. When he was a teenager, he got put in prison for 7 years for committing sexual assaults. He would go on to say the fact that he was put in prison is the reason why he went on to murder. When he began his slicing and dicing, or strangling in this case, he was managing a shell organization. An organization called Youth Against Human Abuse. Shithole's primary target was black women between the ages of 19 and 45. The majority of his victims were people he was actually interviewing to work for his charity organization, where he would show them to like remote fields, take them on tours of locations, where he would then beat them, sexually assault them, and then murder them. His weapon of choice was the victim's own underwear that he would strangle them with. One of his victims brought along their 2-year-old son, which he then beat him against his head, and then left him out in the sun to die of exposure. By 1995, Hittle would claim over 30 victims. He would call the families of the victims, specifically just to taunt them and make fun of them. And South Africa, in general, was in mass panic mode when all of this was happening. In 1995, Hittle contacted a journalist, and he called himself, yeah, I'm the murderer. I'm the one you guys are looking for. He would then be arrested, and he showed the police to where some of his victims were buried just to prove he was telling the truth. And in one of these instances, he actually tried to flee, but the cops cornered him and they shot him because he attacked one of the officers with a freaking hatchet. He didn't die. They confirmed 38 total victims of this maniac, but he then began to claim up to 76. Hittle was convicted and sentenced to 2,410 years in prison, eligible for parole around the young age of 930.